Grizzly Island. About 2 hours north of I-90 in Montana lays Murray Bay Campground, situated on the north side of Hungry Horse Reservoir. The campground has 15 sites, all within a 2-minute walk down to the massive reservoir, whose serene majesty equals the best of the naturally formed mountain lakes in the area. A number of islands dot the water, some big, some small. The one within swimming distance of Murray Bay Campground was big. The Martin family rolled into Campsite 12 in the late morning heat of the early summer, their overstuffed car sporting a thick layer of dust, a gift from the 25-mile gravel road that belted the reservoir. The Martins were a fairly typical Minneapolis family. Mr. and Mrs. Martin both taught junior high, having met at their first school, but now work at separate campuses. Their 2 teenage sons, Brian and Matt, got out of the car first. While not the most outdoorsy kids throughout the year, the 2 were always excited for the annual trip out west. Matt was the older of the pair by about a year, but Brian the more confident. Not by much, but enough to garner the occasional comment. The difference played out in ordinary ways, this time with Brian already unpacking the tent before the parents Martin had fully collected themselves out of the car, all while Matt took in the scenery. His gaze followed some ground squirrels rooting around the brush. With the tent up, the 4 began organizing their food in preparation for lunch. While debating over to have the burgers or the sausages for lunch, with the other being their dinner, a golf cart casually stopped at the edge of the site. "How's it going, folks?" asked the middle-aged woman behind the wheel. Her small boy sat next to her, swatting a stick at nothing in particular. Mrs. Martin stood closest to the woman, and so replied, "Not too bad. Looking forward to getting camp settled and relaxing. And it'll be a great day for it, too. I'm Shelley," the woman said with a wave. "I'm the caretaker of the camp. My trailer is just up the hill where we sell firewood if you need it. The closest dumpster and water pump is also right up there. The nearest restroom is about 30 feet beyond the back of your camp." "Perfect," piped Mr. Martin. "Now I see you got your food out. Just be sure to lock it in your car or in the food locker right here when you're done," Shelley continued as she pointed to a brown metal box. "No worries," said Mrs. Martin. "We know the drill." "I'm sure you do, although I don't mean to alarm you all. I am required to mention we have had a juvenile black bear in some of the sites recently, and there's a younger grizzly over on the island there. He came over last season, but we scared him off, and we haven't seen him on this side since." Brian and Matt looked at each other. They've been coming to bear country for 5 years straight, yet haven't seen a grizzly bear before. "Thanks for the heads up, Shelley," responded Mrs. Martin. We'll be sure to keep the bear spray handy." "It'll never leave my side," said Mr. Martin, patting the can clipped to his belt. Shelley nonchalantly pulled her son back into the golf cart as she concluded her spiel. "Sounds like you're all set then. Again, I'm just at the top of the hill if you need anything. Have a nice day." And with that, she drove on to the next occupied campsite. Brian and Matt had been trying to contain their rising excitement during the exchange of pleasantries between the adults, but couldn't hold it in after Shelley departed. Brian had already made his way out of the camp when Matt turned to yell over to their parents, "We're going to walk around the campground." "You two have fun now. Lunch will be ready in an hour," Mr. Martin said with a proud wave of his hand and a bundle of firewood in the other. The boys gave an understanding nod to their father as they began their search for a grizzly. Despite the fact the lake, and now dubbed Bear Island, were visible from the Martins' tent, Brian and Matt had to wander a good 20 minutes before Matt found a small trail leading down to the water. Within a minute of trundling along the sloped forest path, the trees cleared as the teens stepped out to the gravelly shore. The cooling breeze made ripples on the surface of the otherwise calm lake. Brian scanned the opposing shoreline of the island in desperate hope of seeing the bear emerging to lap up some water. Much to his disappointment, the rocky banks were empty. Without averting his gaze, Brian said to Matt, "There's a bear somewhere on that island. Just right over there." Matt didn't need it spelled out for him. He knew what his brother was suggesting. Matt reached down to touch the water as he looked along the small strait between the island and the peninsula the campground was situated on. After compiling his data, he spoke up. "The water isn't too cold, and it looks like the gap is smallest over there." Matt pointed 30 yards to Brian's right, whose eyes followed the gesture. What Brian saw was the perfect crossing point, a 20-foot swim in shallow water. "You sure about this, man?" Matt asked as the two made their way to the crossing. 100%. "We don't have to get close to it. I just want to see it from a distance. It shouldn't be too hard to find. Grizzlies are huge. You can't tell me you also don't want to see it." There was a fire in Brian's eyes as he spoke. The wind rustled through the trees as Matt conceded. "You're not wrong, but let's be smart about this, okay? Let's remember what the park ranger said last year in Glacier. If you encounter a bear, don't turn and run. Keep facing it as you slowly back away. And don't look them in the eye, added Brian in agreeance. Matt continued his safety brief. We also don't want to get all our clothes wet from swimming. So I'm thinking we tie our shirts and jeans around our boots and try to throw them across. Good thinking, Brian said as he took off his shirt. After a couple minutes of fumbling about, the two brothers were down to their boxers, each holding a clothes bundle. Brian tossed his first, giving all his strength to hurl the asymmetric pack. The balled-up clothes rocketed to the left instead of straight ahead, splashing into the water. God damn it, he cried as he trudged into the clear water and began to swim for his things. As he did so, Matt's own clothes unceremoniously landed on the island, perfectly dry. He made a quick swim over while Brian dove a few feet down. Brian met up with Matt, who at this point only needed to put his boots on. Huffing from the exertion, Brian managed to say, "The water wasn't as deep as I thought." "Yeah, I suppose we could have waded across, holding our clothes above our heads. Let's remember that for the way back." The two were finally dressed, after Brian struggled with his soaked socks and wet denim, when the wind slowed and a rustling was heard from the tree line. The boys whipped around, the fear on their eyes turning to amusing wonder as a deer nibbled on some leaves, paying no attention to the trespassers. Matt let out a sigh of relief. Not gonna lie, that got me. Brian nodded as he replied, "Yeah, me too. Let's try to keep our eyes more peeled." Matt gave his own nod in response before the two walked a few paces along the shore away from the grazing deer, before veering into the trees. Mere feet into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The wind had completely died, leaving an eerie silence hanging over the adventurous teens. "Weird," let out Brian in a hushed tone. Matt surveyed the area as shifting clouds cast a shadow onto his face. "Let's keep moving," he finally said, with a look of growing concern. They continued on in a seemingly straight line, occasionally pausing at the slightest noise. Every time, the source was discovered to be a bird or another ground squirrel. Eventually, the boys came across their first sign of a bear. Brian saw it first as he was walking a few paces further ahead. He hurried Matt over with glee. As Matt walked up, he looked past his brother, focusing on a tree with the bark all torn away in one spot. His eyelids narrowed as he looked to the ground. The dirt was mostly dry, but the impressions left were unmistakably large paws, about the size of his own face. With Brian closely inspecting the tree, Matt debated whether to keep encouraging him by pointing out the bear tracks. He gave a thoughtful look to Brian again, whose face was flushed red from the oppressive heat. Brian's soaked clothes were drier in spots, with a little steam from the evaporating water wafting up into the air. Matt could tell the remaining wetness was probably sweat. When did it get so muggy, he thought. Brian interrupted his pondering with a simple question. Well, what do you think? While that tree is a cool find, I'm thinking we should turn back before things get too dangerous. Sense was slowly returning. Oh, come on. We can't turn back now. I told you. We just have to get a look from afar, Brian pleaded. With a tinge of sympathy, Matt snapped back. But what if we don't see it until it's up close? What can we do against a bear? We do exactly what we did when that black bear ran down the mountain and stopped right in front of us on that trail 2 years ago. It stared at us. We made ourselves look bigger, and it continued down the slope. They're just foraging animals. They don't hunt humans. Besides, didn't that old woman say they scared the bear off last year? It's probably a wimp. Brian's words made a lot of sense to Matt, whose doubts began to fade. The two had indeed faced multiple black bears that trip, and didn't have any issues. The bears simply weren't interested. That may be the case, Matt said, with a softening tone. But you're also not looking so good. You look like you're overheating. I can't argue with you on that one, admitted Brian, holding his hands up in surrender. I've been a little lightheaded for the last 10 minutes. Maybe we should head back to the beach to give me a chance to cool down with the breeze. Maybe a quick swim, too? I like the way you think, Matt agreed. He had decided to tell Brian about the tracks in the dirt. After they both cooled down, the two could hear the lapping water of the lake not too far off, from the far shore they had come from. The trek was a short one, with the boys eventually coming out onto the bank. This side of the island gifted them with the view of the entire lake. No campground in sight. The sun's light gently glistening off of the surface of the surrounding mountains towered beyond. It was truly beautiful. Brian tried to hide his slight disappointment when he realized the breeze hadn't picked up again, but went on about preferring to swim anyways. Matt, who had turned away from the water to face the trailing Brian, stopped listening to his brother at some point. Matt's eyes widened as he stared behind Brian into the trees. Brian cut himself off and turned as he simultaneously saw Matt slowly point and heard a branch crack. Sure enough, a massive grizzly bear was pushing its way past the trees towards them. The bear was easily 3 times as big as the two boys combined, its immense weight crushing everything under its thundering paws. It stared straight into Brian's soul. Brian stared back, frozen in abject terror. His heart shot to his throat. Brian had seen his grizzly, but the sheer size of it from this short distance was too much for his mind to process. Instinct took over. Brian bolted to the right, screaming incoherent wails at the top of his lungs. When he finally found his voice, he didn't get more than 15 feet before the tremendous power of the bear's claw dug into his back. Matt watched on as Brian flew forward, the strike lifting him off his feet. Brian landed on his stomach, crying out in agony. In an instant, his ordeal would continue as the great grizzly clamped down onto Brian's shoulder with teeth the size of pocket knives. Matt heard a cacophony of cracks and pops as Brian's screams turned shrill. Only a second later, but feeling like an eternity for Matt, the two ends of the bear's mouth met as it bit clean through the shoulder. He couldn't take seeing this go on anymore to his younger brother. Without thinking, Matt picked up the largest rock he could find. He charged the bear with the stone held high in both arms as he yelled to bolster his courage. Although the grizzly's own grunting and gnawing drowned out the war cry. With a strength he didn't think possible, Matt brought down the small boulder onto the distracted bear's bloodied snout, hitting what was left of Brian's shoulder in the process. Brian and the bear let out a synchronized wounded roar, with the bear backing up a few feet, shaking its head in obvious pain. Brian just laid there, his arm hanging on by a mess of ripped muscle. Without wasting a moment, Matt picked up his delirious brother, who began to babble under his breath as the blood loss hit him. Brian's gored arms scraped across the offshoots of a bush as they made a break into the trees. That little resistance provided the last straw for the arm to finally tear away. The popping of the remaining shredded tendons echoed around the island. Brian didn't even notice. As they raced across the island in the vain hope of reaching the campsite, of reaching help, Matt heard another roar from the bear, this time filled with fury. He carried on, slinging Brian's remaining arm around the back of his neck to further support the increasingly dead weight of the injured teenager. Brian popped out of his haze to scream as Matt's efforts inflamed the pain of the claw marks the bear had left in his back. Matt didn't dare stop, or even look when the sounds of the grizzly barreling through the brush filled his ears. He had to keep going. The brothers exploded onto the shoreline and plunged into the water as a small crowd had gathered on the edge of the lake, attracted to the sounds of the attack. The pair had waded halfway across when the pursuing bear sent a wave of water crashing down on them as it, too, leapt into the lake. Matt and Brian kept moving, 1 foot at a time, with the weight of the water dragging them down. The bear advanced 2 feet for every one of theirs, with the lake bubbling red from the commotion and the blood. The now fleeing onlookers knew the boys were done. Only 2 people pushed against the crowd towards the helpless brothers. They were the boys' parents, Mr. and Mrs. Martin. Mr. Martin held the can of bear spray square in front of him, the safety cap thrown aside. He lined up his shot as Mrs. Martin ran into the chaos of the water. The bear lunged forward just as the capsicum powder punched its face, causing the great mammal to fall sideways, missing the brothers by inches after Mrs. Martin swung them around out of the way. The bear thrashed violently as it retreated all the way back to the safety of its island. A calming silence fell as the dutiful parents tended to their crying sons. Shelley, having a good head on her shoulders, had already radioed for a medical airlift. Only minutes after dragging Matt and Brian back to the camp, the helo lifted Brian up in a basket. His limbless shoulder wrapped in a blood-soaked beach towel that was handed to Mrs. Martin by a fellow camper who finally found some courage. The rest of the Martin family later raced to the hospital to find a traumatized but recovering Brian. Murray Bay Campground closed for the following days as wildlife officials captured, tagged, and relocated the young grizzly bear to a more remote part of the national forest. There were never any new reports of trouble from the animal. The end. Copyright Max Hannam, 2023.